my first question is whether the requirements of kind of like the US system for kind of like reaching this threshold of espionage, satisfying the conditions of the Espionage Act, whether that will satisfy foreign courts in extradition proceedings, whether they might see actually, well, we think this prosecution is a little bit over-encompassing in the definition of espionage. So whether that will come into any future possible extradition proceedings. My second question is, I don't know, perhaps I'm looking for a bit of a get-out-jail-free card for Julian, maybe not. But I remember in the UK there was a lady called Catherine Gunn, I think her name was, who was a GCHQ analyst, who did a bit of whistleblowing when she found that GCHQ and its associated agencies were actually spying on UN proceedings, so actual members of the United Nations as they were in their secret sessions. Some of the communications were being intercepted and being used to brief the British government. So this analyst found that this was occurring and reported the fact that newspapers. She was then prosecuted but then acquitted. Now I believe the acquittal came because the government actually proved their case and the judge directed, I might be wrong at this point, but I think the judge directed a verdict of guilty, but the jury said, you know what, actually we think we don't want to do that, we're going to return a not guilty verdict. I was wondering, is that a possible outcome in this case?
You mean just kind of jury nullification, essentially?
Yeah, so the jury say, we realise it's guilty, but actually we're going to say not guilty, just we agree with what you did.
I have a hard time believing, going in reverse order again, I have a hard time believing that an American jury would nullify. Okay. Taking the temperature of the average American toward this, I don't see a lot of sympathy toward WikiLeaks and to Assange, much less any interest whatsoever in like the actual kind of language of the statute and perhaps the radicalness of the arguments. Now, I would certainly, if he asked me, if anyone asked me to be involved in his defense, that would certainly be something that you would want to push again and again and again. And this is whistleblowing activity that is desperately necessary to reveal the lies that have been told to the U.S. people about the very unpopular war in Iraq. So there's a bunch of cables about that. So I would give it a shot if I was a defense attorney, but I'm somewhat cynical toward American jurors in general. And I think this is, whenever you're talking about national security, it just becomes very hard to get people to think more critically about legal niceties. In terms of your first question, it's a really good one. When I give the much longer version of this talk, I talk about extradition. Because I actually think one of Assange's best hopes would be that Sweden, most likely, would not turn him over to the United States to face these particular charges, the doctrine of specialty, or the double criminality requirement. There certainly is there are some countries that have relatively equivalent crimes to these. Australia would be one. The UK would be one. But to the best of my knowledge, and I'm certainly not going to claim to be an expert about Swedish criminal law, they don't really have any kind of espionage provisions that are anywhere near as malleable as these. So I think it actually would be fairly unlikely that on these charges they would send Assange to the United States. Now there would be, abuse of official information. Manning would be in bigger trouble. Not an issue, of course, because he's in prison in the U.S. But if anything, there will be, from the best of my knowledge, there will be certain kinds of computer crimes that Assange might have committed that would be criminal under both American and Swedish law. But the U.S. might have a very hard time convincing Sweden to extradite. But I'm not an expert in extradition. I'm just based on my knowledge of the double criminality requirement and looking at what I can find about the equivalent criminal law in Sweden. So I think if I was Assange, I would be hoping desperately that, in some ways, ironically, he might be better off in Sweden. At least, well, if you're an American media organization, you're going to be awfully nervous. I mean, I took a quote out from, again in the longer version, from Jack Goldsmith, who is a very conservative American national security law scholar. And, to their credit, there are plenty of conservative national security law scholars who think this prosecution is ridiculous. They're like, this is what government officials do. They leak information. Governments leak information to the media when it's helpful. Whistleblowers leak information to the media when it's not helpful. And he says, what the US government should do is forget about Assange and fix its friggin' classification system. Prevent these leaks from being disclosed. Don't go after WikiLeaks for prosecuting them, because he admits there's no distinction between WikiLeaks and the media. So if there's an optimistic spin from my talk, at least the longer version of my talk, it's that although I think there's no legal problem prosecuting Assange, I'm really not convinced that the US government would go ahead with an actual prosecution of him because of their, they've tried to find ways to distinguish WikiLeaks from the newspapers, but even the media, other than people like Bill Keller, don't seem to be really convinced that they're somehow going to have a get a jail-free card if Assange is prosecuted. So the political optics of it, I would be more optimistic of from Assange's standpoint. Because your question's a really good one. I mean, if he were to be prosecuted under this act successfully, it would have a crippling effect on newspapers. And sadly, from a more political standpoint, the only leaks that would ever be published would be the ones that are orchestrated by the government. The ones that the newspapers would know, because this is a government-sponsored leak, isn't going to end up being prosecuted in a court of law. So I'm a little hopeful of that as well, that the US government will just, as much as they might want to prosecute him, realize that, I don't think there's a First Amendment problem, but the optics of it. The Espionage Act is very deliberately written in a way that does not limit it to espionage by people who owe a duty of loyalty to the United States. There's no reason why, at least textually, it doesn't apply to any foreigner who misuses American classified information. Now, a foreigner might have a better shot, convincing a jury that the mens rea is not satisfied with how do I know about American classification systems and all of this? But at least in terms of just the personal jurisdiction of a court, I'm sure that Assange's government lawyers would argue precisely that. But again, I just don't see it being a successful argument, given that there doesn't seem to be any indication that this was designed to be limited to Americans. Rightly or wrongly, and wrongly is probably the better answer.
Any more questions for everyone?
What about Assange? Sorry, guys.
No, go ahead, Kevin.
Okay. What about Assange and WikiLeaks published the flaws in the Warlock IED system? Now, without going into it too deeply,
good, because you'll lose me.
Yeah. Basically, when you're disarming an IED, which is an explosive device, the bombs that you see, there is a frequency that the person who's going to explode the bomb uses. They phone a mobile phone to that bomb and it explodes. So the US Army used a blocking device to prevent people from phoning in on that frequency. It also, unfortunately, prevented from communicating internally, thus setting exceptional conditions for an ambush by Al-Qaeda, Taliban, etc. Those were on the website. That's one particular communication that the Taliban could use to its own benefit. So, in my view, based on that information alone, he could potentially be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. And second to that, as you said, a lot of the other newspapers had access to these cables and none of them published that information, but WikiLeaks still did. So that sets them, that puts them in a different category from the regular media, if that makes sense. You said radical transparency, and that's true. Assange is, like in his essays on conspiracy and conspiring and secrecy tax, he basically suggests that if there is secrecy in a planning group or a government, then people are distrusted, and people who are distrusted get kicked out of that group, and it becomes so small that it becomes ineffective and inefficient. So in that sense, WikiLeaks is separate to the media in that it has a separate motivation, and that is radical transparency, forced radical transparency.
Yeah. I don't think anyone is saying that WikiLeaks is completely on all fours with the New York Times, but I think in terms of their status as a media organization, it's impossible to argue that WikiLeaks is in a completely different category than the New York Times and Le Monde, etc. And that, from a legal standpoint, that's really what's important. Your first question, I think, is a very good one, and I'm certainly not claiming that nothing that WikiLeaks has ever released has been harmful to national security. And I do think, and again, since it was very recent, I hadn't really that much time to think about it and working into this talk, the fact that they have released the 250,000 documents in total does change things. because that does mean that they have released documents that the media hadn't. But, you know, insofar as these cables are harmful to national security, I think it is impossible to argue that the newspapers have not equally released classified documents that are harmful to national security. It may not be the exact same documents that WikiLeaks has released that are harmful to national security, but because, again, we're in a realm where everyone who's involved with WikiLeaks has at some point in time been the first ones to publicize documents that are at least arguably damaging to American national security. Again, I don't see how you legally or normatively distinguish the newspapers from WikiLeaks, although I do think, and I think your point's very well taken, that WikiLeaks has lost a little bit of its moral high ground now, even though I understand why they released all of the documents. I mean, it was the Guardian idiot journalist releasing the encryption file, but there is 248,000, give or take, of those cables have now been released by WikiLeaks at the same time. So, understandably or not, that does change the moral calculus a little bit. I probably have to think a little bit more about that issue.
Just one more question, a sub-question, very quick one. You assume that what WikiLeaks say about the release of the code is accurate. Like, we have no evidence to suggest that. But see, the background to the publication of the code. The background of the publication of the code is that Assange apparently told the author of the book that the code is changed every day, sometimes hourly. It isn't. It wasn't. It never was.
Yeah.
That's the story that's being told.
Can I answer?
Yep.
I mean, that's the story that the journalist is told.
Yeah.
But if you read the book, his account, minute-by-minute account of his discussion with Assange in the book doesn't say anything about Assange saying that this was a temporary code. That was something that he said, and I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong, but from an outsider, as a criminal lawyer who has to judge the relative inferences from circumstantial evidence, to me, he had a far greater reason to fudge the truth after the whole media uproar than when he originally wrote that passage in the book. It seems to me that given that it is a very detailed account of his interaction with Assange and everything that happened in the book before the kerfuffle came out, that he would have put in there, oh, by the way, I was assured that this was just a temporary password. And it's not in that passage in the book. So in that situation, I give WikiLeaks the benefit of the doubt, admitting that I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't know what Assange did. And Assange very well may have said that to him. But all we have to go on is the journalist's own non-self-interested account in the book versus a very self-interested account after he was being accused of being responsible for this massive data dump. So.
Great.